The title of our project is the Technology Acceptance Model on High Immersion Virtual Reality Learning Environments. And my name is Alex. I'm presenting on behalf of Ethan Quaid, Austin Pack, and Litong Zhou. Virtual reality technology has actually been around for quite a long time, but about 7 years ago, with the release of the Oculus Quest by Facebook, we've seen this kind of renaissance of virtual reality, and it is very much mass marketed to the consumer, to everybody, to you and me. And you see these advertisements like you're seeing now with people with these boxes strapped to their faces with very amazed expressions and reaching out and apparently touching things that are seemingly not there. And there's just a lot of hype around this technology because it's new and it's very futuristic. And it's come to the attention, obviously, of teachers and of researchers. And so we wanted to kind of explore this hype a little bit and test out this technology for learning purposes in languages. We had basically two very fundamental questions about it. Is this technology useful for language learning, and is it easy to use? And basically with these two questions, we would presume that the technology would be successful in a classroom. So if it's useful, that means that students are able to either more quickly or effectively accomplish their goals. And if it's easy to use, then it is not something that's cumbersome or complex, and we don't want, obviously, technology that's too complicated in the classroom. We don't want to spend a lot of time training students on it or going through tutorials. We want to take the technology and apply it and have it work right away. And so based on these two fundamental questions, we carried on with our research. To position our research amongst the other kind of literature, I would like to introduce this kind of spectrum of virtual reality, which goes from low to high immersion. Immersion is the quality where you're kind of sensorially enveloped in a virtual reality. And this term has been applied to a variety of technologies, from just three-dimensional graphics on a computer, such as a desktop computer, to the more head-mounted display units that you might be familiar with. There have been a lot of studies on the lower end of the spectrum, such as Huang and her colleagues in Taiwan, but obviously not so much on the other side here because the technology is much newer, with higher immersion systems. And so our study is focused more on the high immersion systems here. We had three hypotheses that we are using to pursue this analysis. One was the perceived ease of use, like how easy was the technology to use, will have a positive impact on the perceived usefulness of the technology. And so we think that these two questions are related, whereas if the technology is very easy to use, then it means students will also think of it as being more useful. Our second hypothesis is that the perceived ease of use will have a stronger impact on the behavioral intention to use than perceived usefulness will. And here we look at the behavioral intention to use the technology, which is what we're kind of striving at. We want students to kind of adopt this technology, to accept it. And we think that between the two constructs of how easy it is to use and how useful it is, the perceived ease of use will have a stronger impact on the behavioral intention to use. And lastly, the technology acceptance model, which is by Davis in 1989. We think that this model will be representative of the students' acceptance of the high immersion VR system. So this is Davis's model here, and you can see there are two exogenous variables here, which is perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. Both of these point towards the intention to use. So that means that these are influencing the intention to use the technology. Perceived ease of use also hypothetically has an influence on the perceived usefulness of a technology. And so you see there's this kind of triangular uh, 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 pattern of influence here. Yeah, so the more useful it is, the more likely they are to adapt it. The more easy it is to use, the more likely they are to adapt it, and the more useful it will seem. The virtual reality learning environment that we used in this study was designed for learning. So it was specifically created. We created it in-house, and it was not a game. It was specifically a learning environment. It incorporated a single academic task, which I will describe in more detail in a moment. And there are varying degrees of difficulty. You can see here in the picture, our colleague Li Tong is working with a participant going through the task. And she can see pretty much everything that that participant is doing through the TV monitor there. And so she can coach them, guide them, and so forth through the task. If they encounter any difficulties in the environment, she can kind of work that out for them. As I mentioned, the environment is fully immersive, and so when you're in there, that's all you can see is the virtual environment. You can't see any peripheral distractions, and so you're kind of focused on what's in front of you. Participants will open a menu and select a difficulty level, and they can choose from a variety of different paragraphs. So the academic task is a paragraph structure task. And the task is basically to read the paragraph and then paint each sentence a different color based on that sentence's function within the paragraph. So you can see that there's a table with buckets of paint in front of them. Each paint color stands for a different sentence function. So blue is for topic sentence, red is for supporting idea, green is for supporting detail, and so forth. So what this participant is doing is selecting a color of paint and then applying it to that sentence. And they'll go through each sentence and color it until the entire paragraph is colored, and that will be the end of that. And so you can see they're doing a different color for the second sentence, and so forth and so on. So let me describe our method. We had 134 undergraduate participants in this study at a Sino-British university in China. We gave each one of those participants a one-on-one session with the virtual environment, and those sessions lasted about 12 minutes. They were able to go through at least one, sometimes up to 3 different paragraphs to try to get a handle for what the task was and operating the system and so forth. Afterwards, they completed a questionnaire, and then we took that data and analyzed it with a covariance-based structural equation model. We used a 7-point Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and you can see that our descriptive statistics show that the responses to these 3 constructs all fell within the range of 5 to 6, so it was agreeable. Nobody said that it wasn't easy to use or it wasn't useful or they didn't intend to use it. So everything was agreeable there, which is good, but we're mostly interested in is did the items measure what we wanted them to measure, and how did those measurements interact with each other? So with our measurement model, we first started with an indicator reliability using Cronbach's alpha to test the internal consistency of the items. We wanted those numbers to be above a 0.7, and they were, and so that's fantastic. We also checked the composite reliability, another tool for internal consistency. We wanted those to be between a 0.7 and a 0.95, and they were right there in the middle, so that's great. For convergent validity, we checked the average variance extracted to tell the percent of variation explained among the items of the construct. And so we wanted these to be above a 0.5, and they're well above that, so that's great. And finally, our discriminant validity check was the Fornal-Larker method using the square root of the average variance extracted to compare the correlations between the other constructs, and there was no overlap there, which is great. That means that our items were accurately measuring the constructs, and the constructs were measuring different phenomena. And so we felt confident going forward with our model analysis. These are the structural model results. And starting with perceived usefulness here, you can see that its effect on the intention to use was quite strong and significant. However, the perceived ease of use had a very weak and non-significant effect on the intention to use. So what we see here is that, if students felt that VR was useful, if it helped them to accomplish their goals, if it helped them to learn the paragraph structure, they were more likely to want to use it again in the future. However, if the technology was easy to use or very difficult to use, that had pretty much no influence at all on their intention to use it again in the future. This is something that has been reported by others, so that the perceived usefulness is the dominant kind of effect between these two constructs, and that perceived easy use typically is non-significant and weak. And so this is not unusual, but it is pretty interesting to see this common amongst virtual reality technologies. And the performance of perceived usefulness on the intention to use could have a variety of explanations. Perhaps the students just didn't have any difficulty in using the technology, and therefore, it was a non-issue. But also, students might just have a high tolerance for complex technologies, or they just have kind of expect a high learning curve when it comes to new technology, and so they don't let that kind of influence their decision to want to use a technology again in the future, especially if they find that technology to be useful. The perceived ease of use did have a moderate and significant effect on the perceived usefulness, and so the easier it was to use, the more useful students found that technology to be. And so there was kind of maybe perhaps an indirect effect from perceived ease of use onto the intention to use. With the coefficient of determination, the perceived usefulness had a rather small percent of variance explained. There's a single, obviously, only one variable accounting for that. And so it's not necessarily small for one variable, but it is small nonetheless, which means, that there are probably multiple other factors that we didn't observe that are influencing the perceived usefulness of virtual reality technology. With the intention to use, however, the R² was quite high at 80%. And so that means that these two factors, our perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use, were accounting for the majority of the variance of the student's intention to use VR. In order to determine whether or not our model was a good fit, we used a number of established fit indices. And so our probability was non-significant, which is good. Our chi-squared divided by the degrees of freedom was between 1 and 3. Our goodness of fit index was above a 0.9. The adjusted goodness of fit was not quite at at the benchmark we wanted it to be, but it was still pretty good. Our MC was also a little bit higher than what we wanted it to be. It was supposed to be at a 0.06 or less. It was 0.064, but that's still okay. And the rest of them down here were all at their benchmarks according to our statisticians. And so based on this, I think we're pretty happy with the model fit, and that it was a good representation of our theory and of our data. All right, so in conclusion, basically, we have a few points here, which are learners' behavioral intention to use VR is unlikely to be affected by the perceived ease of use of the technology. That, in fact, the perceived usefulness was the main thing. The perceived ease of use of VR does influence perceived use. The perceived ease of use of VR does influence the perceived usefulness of it, which in turn carries practically all the way on the intention to use. And so perceived ease of use is still important, but just an indirect kind of influence in the model. Finally, the model, Davis's TAM model, was a good fit for the data, which is not surprising. It's a very well-known model. It's a very highly adapted model, an adaptable model. And so we're glad to see it carry on its worth. Future research that we're interested in looking at is the what is affecting the perceived ease of use. Why is it not associated with the intention to use VR? Is it because students just didn't have any difficulty with the technology, or is it something else? So we are be interested in why that phenomenon occurs in technology acceptance literature, and also what factors, if any, might influence the perceived ease of use. We know that they're perceived usefulness of VR. So the coefficient of determination for perceived usefulness is rather small. There must be other external variables that are affecting it. And so what could those be, and how do they affect the perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use? These are the references that we cited in this presentation. And that is it. And so,
thank you very much.
yeah, I can stop sharing, I guess.